Why monitor inflammation in enhanced bodybuilding? What's up, guys? John Jewett with J3 University. Today I wanted to address a topic about inflammation and how it could be maybe considered the other silent killer in bodybuilding, when we know a lot of people state blood pressure is one of the silent killers because you don't really feel it when it is getting elevated. And it can be like just moderately high elevations for a long duration, which can damage a lot of different organ systems in the body. But also inflammation is one that can also be occurring in the background, low chronic systemic inflammation, and is very arguably one of the large contributors to a number of disease states. So in research, we can look at current PED users compared to their bodybuilding natural counterparts, and you see that they do have elevations in CRP levels, which is C-reactive protein. This is something your liver produces under a state of just generalized inflammation. So nothing for a specific region, it just puts this out. So you see that there is this inflammatory state going on in the enhanced PED user, and you have to say, well, you know, why is this even an issue? And this low inflammation rate has been linked with a number of different disease states and an independent risk factor for them. So just this alone being elevated is enough risk for atherosclerosis, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, and metabolic syndrome, which with metabolic syndrome, as a PED user, you kind of share a very similar profile to someone that's obese or overweight with dyslipidemia, hypertension, and insulin resistance. So these three things in combination, for one, cause a lot of inflammation in general, and also we see that in the obese state, but you see it in someone that's a lean bodybuilder but is also using PEDs. So why does this happen? And there's a lot of things mechanistically that go on with using growth hormone, anabolic steroids that drive this inflammatory process. For one, just being more overweight or obese, just having high body fats could do it, like in the off-season state. But also anabolics have a preferential partition into visceral adipose tissue. And there's multiple ways that this is changing how you're metabolizing carbohydrates and lipids. At the liver itself, there's an increase in hepatic triglyceride lipase, which basically that breaks down HDL, your quote-unquote good lipoprotein, good cholesterol, and increases your small dense LDL particles, which are more atherosclerotic. And so this is already changing to a negative dyslipidemia. Also, you can have insulin resistance occurring in the background just from high body weight, high food, high gear, high growth hormone, all driving up blood glucose, requiring a higher amount of insulin. How do you get insulin resistant? Well, you keep pounding away at these high insulin levels, that requirements. And you get insulin resistant on all peripheral tissues, but at the adipose site. So that your fat cells get insulin resistant. So free fatty acids are no longer going to adipose tissue. They get rerouted to organs, to the liver for processing, and this causes more visceral adipose tissue to be accrued. Visceral adipose tissue produces a lot of cytokines, which are inflammatory factors that can further promote more insulin resistance. So it's kind of this snowball effect that is occurring around lipid and carbohydrate metabolism, insulin resistance, and then partitioning more into visceral adipose tissue. So that's why you end up with this profile that looks somewhat like if you're a very obese individual. And other factors that contribute to this and what anabolics do, for one, they drive up more, and we talked about this in my last video on telmisartan, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and that alone can cause an increase in cytokines. It can also cause arterial stiffness to occur, so like a narrowing and hardening of these blood vessels, which that alone can drive up blood pressure. Also, it's causing increases in aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone, causing more fluid and water retention. And so with all those things combined, you put yourself at a lot of risk being a PED user. And why even know these mechanisms and how all this stuff is working when you're using these drugs is important to know what to do to make interventions to help us mitigate some of the risk. Of course, there's always going to be risk present, but I don't want to be ignorant to that risk. And this is why I dig into the whys and the hows of all this, because if you know those pathways and the mechanisms that are occurring, then you can start building intervention strategies to help with that aspect. And there was a systematic meta-analysis done reviewing a bunch of papers about interventions for nutrition and pharmacology that could lower CRP levels, so lower the systemic inflammatory response. And they came up with 6 compounds that had good potential based on their tolerability, their safety profile, and their efficacy. And so they reviewed all this literature and put it into one statistical model to see what the effect was. And 2 of them didn't have much effect on CRP. That was resveratrol and vitamin D. That's not reasons to throw those in the bin and never use them. It's just as far as this marker was concerned, it was not impactful. But the 4 that was using an ARB, so an angiotensin receptor blocker, like I mentioned in my previous video on the renin-angiotensin system. Also metformin, because metformin helps with metabolic syndrome, improving insulin resistance and decreasing hepatic glucose output. There was also omega-3. And then lastly, there was a probiotic, which was a different one that kind of surprised me as well, as far as what strain and what the amount. There's a lot to know about probiotics, but at least putting all this data together, that's what they came up with. And it was, the decreases were like 0.5 to 0.2 milligram per liter drops, which, to give you some reference to that, the normal range for CRP is less than 1 milligram per liter. Above that, you start getting into moderate risk and then to higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And so this is why we should be pulling these labs when we're testing. You should pull your high sensitivity C-reactive protein so you can see where you're actually at and if you're driving a lot of inflammation. But all the other things that I mentioned, the dyslipidemia, the changing in your LDL, HDL, the insulin resistance, pulling a fasting serum insulin, your blood glucose, your A1C, triglyceride levels, all those things are components in this huge picture. So just because your CRP is like, oh, my CRP is good, doesn't mean you don't have even some other issues occurring around driven by anabolics. So that's why we need to pull all these labs to really look. But for CRP and decreasing inflammation, in this review paper, these were 4 aspects for supplement and nutritional, pharmacological agents that could have a decrease in this low-grade inflammation that work on the same pathways that we face as using anabolic androgenetic steroids and growth hormone. So that's, let me know if y'all have any questions. I can dig farther in different aspects, as there's a lot more you can do around inflammation with diet, exercise, and this was just looking at one little tidbit of it, but I want to give more of the exploratory of how this is occurring, why this is occurring, and that it even is a thing, that you're just aware of it. So leave me down in the comments if you have questions. Happy to answer those for you, and talk to you next time.